This is America's Roundtable. Visit us at americasrt.com. Follow us on Twitter at americasrt. You can find us on YouTube and Facebook. Like and share. We're delighted to have Brian Carney join us this weekend. Brian Carney is a member of the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal and the editor of the editorial page for the Wall Street Journal Europe. He's also the co-author of Freedom, Inc., which was published in 2009 through Crown Publishing.
The ECB, the European Central Bank, in saying, well, we will make these unlimited bond purchases, but only if people first commit to a reform program. That's one of the preconditions of the bond purchases that they announced last week. This is an attempt to keep the pressure on a bit, because I think Mario Draghi, the head of the European Central Bank, also understands that there is an important pressure for reform coming from these very high borrowing rates that some of the countries are being forced to pay. But I don't know how we can get back anymore to a situation in which there are no bailouts. I don't see a credible way for them to say, okay, well, we did it once, but we'll never do it again. They tried that after Greece. And then Ireland came along and Portugal came along and they said, okay, well, we did those three, but never again. At a certain point, you have to give up, and you have to say, okay, we're in the bailout business. I think if we're not there, I think we are there. I think that they have sort of torn up the basis on which they established this with no bailouts. And the question is, how do we limit the damage? How do we limit the moral hazard that comes from the possibility of a bailout if a country gets into trouble?
Brian, as you mentioned, they're putting as a precondition of bailout reforms that have to be implemented in the country. The European Central Bank board member just noted recently, Mr. Asmussen said, there cannot be a repeat of the mistakes with Italy in the summer of last year when the ECB bought Italian sovereign bonds and at the time was unfortunately not used for necessary adjustment measures. So it's not only that the country has to submit and to commit to necessary reforms, but also that the money received through bailout is used for the purposes intended for. There should be some measurements put in place, and if it is not a fiscal pact, what would you suggest for those measurements to be?
I said before, I don't think that the fiscal pact is enforceable. I think that for political reasons, I agree with the sentiment that you should not just give out the money with no strings attached. I think this is the very real conundrum that Europe now faces, having torn up the architecture on which the euro was based, which a fundamental principle of which was no bailouts. They are trying to replace it with alternative mechanisms. I don't think any of those mechanisms are going to be as effective as the discipline of knowing that no bailouts are coming. Now, I just said that we can't go back to a world of no bailouts, but if I were king and I could wave a magic wand and make it happen, that is how I would restore the basic structure of the Eurozone. I would say the bailouts were a mistake and we're not going to do them again, and anybody who tries will be thrown in prison or whatever. I think we can't get there. So the question you're asking is, well, what do we do? And I'm afraid I don't have a particularly satisfying response to that, except to resort to the old Irish joke. When you ask, well, how do I get to Killarney, and the farmer on the side of the road says, well, I wouldn't start from here. How do we get back to a situation where the euro functions as intentions? I wouldn't start from here. I'm not sure that I know the answer to that question. I think they've created an extremely difficult situation for themselves.
Right, because obviously with not having bailouts, some countries will have to get out of Eurozone. And in that case, the Euro project is in question, as politicians like to say. So they would like to see more of economic and political integration. How would you, let's say, this alternative scenario of the countries gradually getting out of Euro, how would that impact Europe?
Well, I think, for example, that if Greece were to leave the Eurozone, which is still I think, a very real possibility even today. I think that the pressure would increase on countries like Spain and Italy, but Spain and Italy are not beyond the point where they could still reform and save themselves. I think Ireland is actually making very good progress towards getting back on its feet. Portugal, somewhat more haltingly. And I think that, a little bit of fear might actually help promote the kind of discipline that these countries need. A surprisingly small amount of growth, reduction in unemployment, consequent increases in tax revenue and reduction in government expenditure, I think could turn around sentiment to a significant degree within Europe and within the investment community. It doesn't take that much for people to say, okay, now they've turned the corner, and to sort of to come back into the market. The problem right now is that they're not really seeing much of a sign of progress, and they're not being given any incentive to invest. And in fact, the European Central Bank, by trying to keep interest rates down, is probably driving money out of these countries because people are not being given enough return to take the risk that something catastrophic happens to the euro.
Brian, it's interesting to note that even Poland's leaders have communicated a concern about entering the Eurozone and have somewhat postponed their efforts to join the euro and embrace it. The citizens of the United Kingdom also have had reservations about the euro. What is the current sentiment by the majority of UK citizens and taxpayers when they look at what's happening on the continent of Europe?
Oh, I think in Britain the prevailing sentiment is Schadenfreude, right? They look at what's going on and they say, "Thank God we didn't sign up for that."
Right.
Britain has its own problems, of course, but it is almost a universally held belief that those problems are made better by the fact that Britain is free to devalue its currency, and in fact it has. The pound is down 25% on a trade-weighted basis since kind of just before the financial crisis, I guess, 2007 or 8. And everybody in Britain is sure that things would be much worse if they didn't have the freedom to devalue their currency. And they look at what's going on in Europe and they just feel that they dodged a major bullet by not joining the euro back when it was founded.
So in essence, Lady Thatcher, when she was prime minister during her last few months in opposing the efforts to join the euro, I'm sure that a great many citizens of the United Kingdom are appreciative of her leadership during that very important crossroad that Britain was facing during that time period.
You would hope so, but, Margaret Thatcher remains a surprisingly difficult and controversial figure, surprising at least from the perspective of an outsider. I look at, what she did for this country. I'm based in London now, and I say, she saved them. And, but what's the old line about, a prophet is respected everywhere, but in his family or in his home? I think that a lot of people in this country have come to view her legacy as a very difficult one, and unfortunately, she doesn't get the credit for a lot of things in this country that she probably deserves credit for, and that's probably one of them.
Mm-hmm. David Cameron certainly faces questions within his own political party, the Conservatives. There's a growing number of individuals within the Conservative Party that have asked for a referendum on the EU. Where do you see this leading to? Will David Cameron propose a referendum, or specifically an alternative to what the MPs are talking about within his own political party?
I think we're still a ways from that, but it sort of depends how things develop in Europe, right? We had the president of the European Commission just the other day saying that we need to decide on a new course for Europe that will involve, fundamentally a much larger role for the European Union in the governance of the countries that are its members. And I think depending on the outcome of that process. If we do get a Europe that demands much more powers over European citizens, then yes, we could move towards a referendum. I doubt we will see one in this parliament, but it depends how quickly Europe moves. The thing is, historically, Europe has never moved quickly on anything. It took them 10 years to do the last big constitutional change. I wouldn't expect this one, even in a crisis, to happen a whole lot faster. It may not take a decade, but it's going to take more than 18 months to take another quantum leap towards a bigger Europe.
We've seen the U.S. Senate recently holding hearings against HSBC and regarding money laundering cases with the rogue states, including Iran, and also organized crime groups around the world. We also heard recently about Standard Chartered being also involved in money laundering with Iran and actually doing transactions during the embargo. We've seen these actions initiated by the U.S. side and U.S. authorities, and we haven't heard anything similar from European side. And on another note, we had a situation of a major money laundering going through the Balkan route and specifically a Hypo Alpe Adria bank. And the question was raised by actually a member of European Parliament from UK, asking European Commission about this particular money laundering case. So answer by European Commission regarding the money laundering by a bank which is headquartered in Austria said, it follows from the directive that if a covered entity such as a bank suspects that funds are the proceeds of a criminal activity, it is required to report these suspicions to a financial intelligence unit, which will further investigate the case and, if necessary, transfer it to the national law enforcement authorities. The Commission has no competence to investigate schemes such as those described by the honourable member. This is the responsibility of the relevant national authorities and ultimately of national courts. The question here is, if European Commission and Europe, when it comes to money laundering cases by specific banks, relies on national courts that are many times corrupt in the countries that really do not uphold the rule of law, how can we also expect from Europe to react and prosecute, go after the banks that are involved in money laundering?
I think that banking supervision fundamentally is, although it may become increasingly a European competence, it is currently a national one. I think it probably belongs there. I think that we would all like to see Europe take money laundering more seriously. I think some countries are taking it more seriously than others, but there's a long history, a little bit of, turning a blind eye to it, whether that's because the bankers are politically powerful or it's a kind of cultural thing. I'm not exactly sure, but we can all, when it comes down to it, if there's something that we really want to get done, we can all wish for, the Commission or somebody else to take it on. But, that's always double-edged, right? Because do we want them deciding in every case what constitutes money laundering and being very aggressive about situations that may look like money laundering to the Commission but look like basically honest tax avoidance to us? A lot of gray areas in there. I think I'm a little bit wary of saying that, what we need is a much more aggressive European Commission on these things. I think the more these things are in the hands of democratically accountable politicians in the long run, the better off we are for it.
And I think herein lies some of the challenges within the European Union, and there have been a number of debates on this issue here about the sort of a two-tier Europe whereby one Europe upholds the rule of law and whereby you have a set of countries that perhaps do not have a strong rule of law and protection of property rights. So you do have the disparity with, for example, the United Kingdom upholding the rule of law, and if there is a specific directive that comes out of Brussels, they implement that immediately. Whereby for other countries, perhaps that may not have a very good or strong rule of law or an implementation or enforcement perspective, you will have that weakness which surfaces, for example, in Greece or other countries in Southern Europe.
Yes, and certainly that is a problem within Europe when you have different attitudes towards how vigorously to enforce rules that are handed down from Brussels. Britain tends to take its European obligations very seriously. I think the last time I checked, the country with the largest number of unimplemented European rules was France. They tend to implement the ones that they like and ignore the ones that they don't. In different areas, different countries will have different attitudes about what is required to be in compliance. Some of that is to some degree inevitable. Even if you had the laws on the books, as you point out, some countries may enforce them, some countries may not. There's an old saying in French politics that nothing is permitted, but everything is allowed under French law, right? If you looked at the letter of the law, you wouldn't be allowed to move your little toe without violating something, but they have come to a position where they sort of look askance at overly vigorous enforcement precisely to come to terms with the fact that if they enforced everything, that there would be nothing left to do.
Right, indeed. So, Brian, as we conclude our time here, what are your final thoughts, or are you, as you look at the European Union and Eurozone specifically, should we remain optimistic that these challenging issues will be resolved in the foreseeable future, or should we remain very concerned about the developments that may surface within Eurozone?
Well, I always try to be an optimist. I'd say we should be, optimistically concerned. I think we're very far from being out of the woods here. There's always hope that countries will get their act together, and that's what most of us would like to see happen. But, I think these problems are a long way from being solved definitively, and you will hear more about the Euro crisis in the weeks, months, and possibly even years to come.
Mr. Brian Carney is a member of the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal and the editor of the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal Europe. He's the co-author of Freedom, Inc., published by Crown. And Brian, we thank you for taking time out of your schedule and joining us on America's Roundtable.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
This is America's Roundtable. Visit us at americasrt.com. Follow us on Twitter at americasrt. You can find us on YouTube and Facebook. Like and share.